Salutations, Spacefarers! I am Cameron Danger Stripmatter, host and warden here at the Panic Table, and this is Mission Control, where we peer into peerless depictions of far-flung fantastical landscapes, our favorite modules, missions, maps, and monsters in the indie TTRPG scene. This season, we're focusing on modules for Mothership 1st Edition, the single most scintillating sci-fi horror RPG ever created. Why? Well, because we love it. Have any publishers paid us to do this? Oh, no. Who sent you? You sure ask a lot of questions. That said, do please consider joining the rest of our ragtag crew manifest. Support the Panic Table by subscribing, checking out our Patreon, and joining the Discord. All of the things you need to know are in the description. Check it out. Today's episode takes us to the furthest reaches of the Hereafter as we delve into the pages of one of Mothership's most comprehensive companion pieces, the realm of CLOUD EMPRESS. Joining us today is Watt of Worlds by Watt and main brain behind the Cicadas druid landscape. Thanks for calling in. Where are you calling from?
Cicada-infested Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Welcome aboard. We're so glad to have you here on this episode of Mission Control. Wellikers. I think one of the reasons that CLOUD EMPRESS stands out to me immediately, and this is a strange thing about the Mothership scene, is so many of the modules and third-party published materials, and even the stuff coming out of Mothership, does its best to create some distance from Earth. It's seldom mentioned or pointed towards, and a lot of the major modules keep it at arm's length for I don't know, for a number of reasons. Suspense of disbelief, a fun sci-fi fantasy vacation for all the players at the table. Can you talk a little bit about this particular module's connection to our planet and the inspirations that you had therein?
The gestation of the ideas for CLOUD EMPRESS started in a very different place. There was a big World War II vibe that sort of started. World War II era technology or trench warfare, those kinds of things were ideas that I was exploring, imagining a new Mothership setting that I felt like would be unique enough to stand out from other creations, other third-party adventures. One of the original ideas I had was that it could be a planet that maybe was sort of isolated from the galaxy for one reason or another. Maybe there were electric clouds or something, and this was a unique planet that was sort of stuck in a period of time due to some external circumstances, so that players could bring in their existing Mothership characters quite easily, but be stuck sort of in a back in time kind of technology that would enable certain interesting kinds of play that I was exploring. So the ecological piece started to happen though when I found a group named Catapulca, Pabita and Garen, and we really started to explore the ecological aspects and some Nausicaa-inspired visuals. Nausicaa became a really strong touch point, as well as Dune and Star Wars and some other things. And what I started to realize as I was thinking about where does this book take place, what is the setting, the idea of Earth or another planet was really on my mind quite a bit. I think for me, what sold it was that I couldn't make an emotional resonance about the tragedy and consequences of the actions of the past on another planet. At least my emotional engagement with what I was writing and thinking about the content, if it was aliens or a terraformed planet, there was some distance removed and it felt like someone else's problem. So I think for me, when playing CLOUD EMPRESS, there is this sense of Earthling responsibility and this sense of interest and exploration and mystery about the time period between now and then, and really strongly grounding it in Earth, I think, centers that ecological piece, what types of things might survive thousands and thousands of years in the future, and what kind of cultural artifacts would be still present or distorted over that period of time. So that became another place for exploration and a lot of creativity, at least on the writing side of things. The science fantasy aspect was a real distinction as well. There are other science fantasy games, but the idea that each piece of technology, each artifact, each thing of ephemera would be fantastical, whimsical, slightly illogical, but also a form of advanced technology. And in CLOUD EMPRESS, the world has advanced to such a place and then devolved from that place that at some point, everything became almost an art. Whatever it was, the excess and the ability to create was so advanced that why wouldn't you have a toaster that was ornately decorated in a nearly indestructible material? And part of that then becomes the folks in the world of Cloud Empress, or the Hereafter as it's called, don't really need to create a whole lot. They do create things, they modify things, but a lot of what they need can be dug up from the ground or scavenged or found in other locations. And culturally, there's almost a reluctance to create new things with the abundance that exists on the planet, and some cultural stigma around the way the planet was treated previous to the current way of doing things, the current sort of civilization. And there's this mysterious torturers group that sort of stands in as this precursor society that there's quite a lot of cultural stigma and resentment and caution around.
These near mythic villains that scorched the very planet to the bone and left this residual material you call chalk, this poison that interferes with every last piece of the landscape, transforms it even as it kills it. And I really liked that you swerved wide of the James Cameron-esque temptation to be like, ah yes, a circle of life, and state at several points throughout your descriptions of the Hereafter that the chalk is not a blessing, it's a curse on this place, and that it is taking even from the highest forms of life on the Hereafter, which in this case are house-sized cicadas. You know what I'm most reminded of when I was reading through this? Have you seen Zardoz?
Yeah, yeah. I don't think I stayed awake for the entire film, but
it's real weird.
Cicadas speaks to you.
There's this area of science fiction storytelling that in my exploration of Mothership modules hadn't been really, this itch hadn't been scratched yet. And it's in this territory of Logan's Run, of Zardoz, of these stories of the after, where civilization has once again begun to rear its head, but it's peopled by these strangely Baroque classes of royalty, and then mostly just humble artisans or dirt digging scavengers and nothing in between.
I think one of the fundamental ingredients to Cloud Empress is trope, and from the graphic design and visual stylings and the art pieces to the writing to the way that the character classes and jobs and setting is built, there is this strong association to 1970s and 1980s science fiction. So I think those things sort of exist enough in the cultural zeitgeist that players should be able to pick things up and start to imagine themselves in this world. One of the longest developed items in the entire game where it was the character sheet, as well as the skills and the job classes in particular. I've gone a number of different directions with the jobs in Cloud Empress, and one of the reasons they are the way they are now was that folks would not need any pre-existing knowledge or would not have any questions when picking which of the 4 jobs that they might want to take. Lordling is probably the most unique, but those words I think are common enough that someone could put that together and get some interest out of that. Sellsword, Courier, and Magician, those are all quite easy to ascertain for most players. And that became a big thing coming around a table to roleplay. I really wanted to make sure that it didn't go so far into the future that folks would not be able to ascertain what's happening and would not need to look up reference materials or have a large outside conversation about what types of technology exists, what types of characters are here, what types of objects exist in the world. Those things could come more easily through discovery and even just building a character.
Something that I think really sparkles about Cloud Empress is its attention to accessibility, and I mean not just in the broad and generic sense, but even just narratively. It feels like something you can just hop in, you go, oh, I understand the feeling of waking up, eating my porridge, and having to go to work. That's a great place to start for a story. But accessibility and also sensitivity, can you talk about the efforts that you put towards doing this? Because in the Panic Table's opinion, it really shows.
Thank you. It's nice to have these things acknowledged, and it is something I thought quite a lot about. The accessibility of the game, at least thematically, I sometimes jokingly say I want this to be your queer friend's first game. So you might have this queer friend or trans friend that's interested in role-playing games. You might be queer yourself, right? But you might have a friend that's interested in the hobby, and this, I think, would be a great place to start for them. And part of that's the theming as well as the mechanical accessibility. I'm pretty sure, I haven't received a formal diagnosis, but I'm pretty sure I have some level of dyscalculia. So for me, a disappointing play experience has always been needing to do addition in front of my friends. Even playing board games, just counting up my points around the track, I'm always like, hey, did I do this right? And I'm the person like clicking the every spot, and my friends are saying it's 16 watt. So for me, creating a system that no math was required during play was both something that I think would create an accessible experience, but also would create more intense and spectacular moments around the table. One of my favorite experiences when playing any kind of role-playing game is when the entire table knows the stakes of a roll. The roll occurs, and then everybody knows what happens as soon as the roll resolves itself. And so that's that big moment where it's this shared experience across the table, intertwining with your friends and your character's fate, and their lives are at stake potentially. Whereas I think some of my least positive gaming experiences in role-playing and board gaming are when a single player is resolving a combat for like 20 minutes and they're doing all these rolls, and it's kind of like, okay, just tell us what happened. Did they live? Did they die? At this point, I'm kind of bored. I'm kind of disengaged. I've looked at my phone on accident. So really making these moments that the entire table could share. One of my pet peeves for science fiction is when there are these radical imaginings of science itself and technology, but the social structures of the period are pretty much exactly transplanted onto a fantastical science setting, thousands of years in the future, and you have secretaries and people talking in 50s language and stuff. But I did try to create new ways of interacting and tried to explore both ecological devastation, but also a hopeful approach to what might living in a certain kind of harmony with the environment look like, and what would a world look like where humanity was no longer the sort of central lever of change, where there's this larger giant cicada force called the Imago that are the primary drivers of what's going on the planet, what can and can't operate and exist. That also creates more space for trans and queer folks, for marginalized folks, hopefully BIPOC players, to explore their own identities in a way that feels less judged or less constricted. When the social structures of today are kind of upended, there's a lot more freedom in what your character could be experiencing and doing, and how you might be able to represent yourself in play.
Throughout, especially the main CLOUD EMPRESS manual specifically, there's at least 2 or 3 occasions where you remind the reader that wherever the Hereafter is, it is not at a point that requires human beings to save it, that they, like you were saying, are becoming reacquainted with their environment and if anything, are at its disposal and not the other way around. And so I think one of the main themes that you see in sci-fi games, especially today, is this bizarre beckoning of or relationship with the apocalypse. And you've chosen something that comes after, these strange chalky flowers blooming and whatever happens well after the apocalypse has occurred. Can you talk a little bit more about your thinking as to why that was the setting you chose?
Post-apocalypse is always presented as something in a potential future, I think, in most of the media that I consume. It's this what if. Whereas if we look at our history, particularly in the Americas, North America and South America, we live on the lands of an apocalypse. If we think about different periods in human history, and we think about how quickly folks' lives were dramatically changed, often for the worse, and all the impacts, ecological, health-related, economic,
you name it, really.
Yeah, we stand in a world that has already experienced numerous apocalypses. I tried to honor in some ways, large and small, this idea of resilience and the joys that can come in resilience and marginalization. And that's not to obviously excuse any of these behaviors and the horrors and tragedies that are associated with it, but really to celebrate this tension in that there is suffering in the world and there's suffering in our history. But also, I think with the setting itself, it's meaningful for me that it's a game, that it's fun, that it's a place that joy can happen, that laughs can happen. So I really believe in the healing power of play on both a personal and cultural. Like as a society, I think play is so valuable, especially play that's cooperative and generally nonviolent, I think. Or at least creates interesting discussions around violence. I think that's what CLOUD EMPRESS does. It's certainly not a non-violent game, but it has some direct discussion with violence and guns and weapons and those kinds of things. So that was big on my mind, was thinking about human resilience in a way that would be not a total downer for folks, but would also help folks engage with their own histories, personal and cultural.
You talked a little bit about why Mothership is a great fit for the Hereafter and the CLOUD EMPRESS experience, but can you talk even more about horror's place here in CLOUD EMPRESS?
I went back and forth for a long time on whether CLOUD EMPRESS would be a Mothership compatible game, and ultimately settled on that for a number of reasons, largely being both the science fiction horror elements that I think are present within the book, and the use of the panic table, which I think is such a fun game design element of Mothership itself. For me, it goes back to this idea of how we imagine ourselves and how we experience life and those around us. It's very common for myself and the people around me to really think of ourselves as these conscious agents who are creating plans and then enacting them. And that's especially true, I think, in OSR type games and games that are really deadly. It's this idea that we're going through a puzzle that's has very severe consequences that could impact our characters or could impact the gameplay and flow of story. So I think for me, the panic table is so exciting because it is this, to me, deep recognition of human fallibility, and that it creates hilarious, horrifying, interesting moments because it's that moment when you're looking for the killer's coming and you're trying to get your keys into the door or the car and they're just shaking and you can't do it. And there's this prism of how we view that. Do we view that with fear and sympathy? Do we view that by yelling at the screen saying, oh my gosh, just put it in the door, just pick it up, they're right behind you? And so I think those moments are quite interesting and also are quite revealing. And any kind of art, to me, plays some role in humanity looking at itself, looking at a mirror. And I think the panic table is a great way to do that. I think the transformation piece is interesting and something I tried to do with the curse system, where you do get sort of a second chance in CLOUD EMPRESS. It is a quite deadly system like Mothership, where there are very real risks to your character. But this idea that if you die, the slip and these otherworldly forces might call back a different version of yourself to this reality that might be cursed with beastly fur, or you might become a ghost, or a number of other things. One, I think that's just funny and fun, but two, the idea of transformation and otherness is certainly near and dear to my heart as a trans queer person, and so something I wanted to explore, but also is another one of those tropes that are often present in Hayao Miyazaki's work, which fingerprints are all over this game.
Magic. Curses slips through time and space as it seems to do what it wants when it wants during gameplay. Can you talk about your decision to incorporate this sort of folksy fantasy into this retrofuturistic vision you've built up for us?
I'm a magic user in games, and casting magic to me is sort of this ultimate power fantasy. Somebody can swing a sword. I could do that if I practiced enough, but to cast something really strange and other and shape and warp reality, to me that's just really cool. Any kind of trope that I'm introducing, there's always a subversion that I wanted to bring to it. And part of that was really fundamentally undermining power fantasies. Mothership is quite good at that, and that was one of the reasons why I've been so attracted to the system, especially after playing a little bit of Pathfinder and spending some time reading through 5e for a while. The idea that characters are fallible and could die is fundamental to CLOUD EMPRESS and fundamental to Mothership, and creates a kind of unique play experience that I had not engaged with, although I'm sure existed in OSR spaces and other kinds of games for a long time, but not something that I was familiar with, whereas most of my experiences with role-playing games was this kind of Marvelification, infallible Greek hero type, where those types of play experiences, at least in my groups, ended in a lot of bloodshed for the folks around them when a character was immortal, essentially. And when everything's a nail and you have a big hammer, it's very easy to send players into a direction where they end up murdering quite a lot of stuff. So for me, having some strong pacifist tendencies, as well as an interest in saying things about our current world and feeling some responsibility for that as well, creating in Mothership a system where characters were fallible, and where even casting so much as a spell would put their life at significant risk or diminish their vitality over time, and the fact that only young people really have the stamina and the bone structure
literally
cast cast spells, yeah, that the use of chalk would deteriorate one's bones was something that I was really interested in. And really, for me, I see all around in my daily life the way that power corrupts, the way that power creates harm, and exploring that in a gameplay setting where the more powerful you become, there are equal consequences associated with that.
Lightning round. Do you need Mothership to play Cloud Empress?
Cloud Empress is a fully standalone rulebook. One of the other nice things or intentional things I did was the rulebook can be downloaded for free on DriveThruRPG. So the full rulebook is available there, although print copies are also available. And that's, again, fully standalone. The stats and some of the items and weapons will generally carry over from Mothership, and you could potentially bring Mothership characters into this setting, but you won't need any other materials beyond the rulebook online that's free, as well as the free introductory adventure, and those can be found on DriveThruRPG.
I would be remiss if we didn't talk about one of your other published works, though, especially in the Mothership space, and that is the queer masterpiece of Hot Stuff on Shore Leave. Would you mind telling us a little bit about this incredible module that I only experienced just as you sent it to us, and it's just blowing my damn mind. Can you talk about that?
Well, thank you for that. Hot Stuff on Shore Leave was my first crowdfunding project on Kickstarter, and it takes place between sessions of Mothership. And so the intention is that it's a single player experience that you'll roll and use between sessions of a game of Mothership. And essentially it's your character going on shore leave in a particular place. It's called Port Taxico. It's a sort of island destination that's been taken over by a hot sauce factory. So the skyline is toxic and polluted and burns the eyes, and the water burns the skin. But it is a space to explore time off, and particularly it does sort of exist in the more canonized Mothership setting. But it really explores, to me, one of the greatest and neatest things that Mothership does, which is this economic corporate horror that's so interesting. This idea that there are murderous, horrible things in the universe, but the uncaring aspect of capitalism in your work structure forces you into those things, or does not care about the outcomes of your life. I think that's particularly horrifying and a great counterpoint to those more exaggerated science fiction aspects. But this really takes place in what does it mean to have a few days off in this dystopian hard life, and how does one experience queerness when you're on these spaceships for years at a time, maybe in hyper sleep or frozen or just doing this really dangerous stuff. And so there's some mechanical elements to just take care of those shore leave aspects that are in Mothership 1E, but also then just this exploration of what does time off look like, whether it's hooking up with someone, whether it's grabbing food, taking a bath, these sort of quieter moments, but also I think a real reflection on COVID lockdown and feelings of being claustrophobic and sort of a little stuck. You don't have the full freedom that you might want to, and you're somewhat limited in what options you can explore. And so that was another big part of that.
Two things. One, Hot Stuff on Shore Leave is filled with shocking and delightful tables of all sorts of nonsense, ranging from the frightfully serious to the absolutely flippant, none of which sticks out to me as much as page 20's Hot Sauce Creator, which, why not? I just absolutely love that. And would you mind if I actually quoted you here and read out one of my favorite passages in the thing? To be queer in the shipping yards is to be strange. To be organic sludge in the gears of a machine, queerness struggles to become capital. You're off the job, they say, when they dare to step into ourselves. We must be invisible in tight quarters. Underneath the surface, queerness bubbles and boils. This thing rocks, so check that out. I also wanted to point out in Cloud Empress, the player's aid. This thing I would just include at every table, even if I had the misfortune of not experiencing Cloud Empress. It's probably the most succinct, most well-designed, how the heck do I play Mothership card for individual players I've ever seen.
The Cloud Empress player aid, like you said, probably could be used for Mothership as well. You can get it for free on cloudempress.com and print off your own copies. It is a distillation of some of the things that I wanted players to be able to reference at the table, but also help them thematically and quickly understand the stakes of the game. Having played more Mothership than probably any other system, especially with new players, it's really important to set their expectations, how often they'll fail and how dangerous the world is. And so there is a section that talks about the sort of talk, run, fight, talk, hide, no, talk, run, hide, fight. Okay.
Yeah.
I know they do workplace trainings on these, so without talk being present, really just encouraging players to solve problems with their characters if they can in non-violent ways. And one of the things that is hard for new players to understand, but as you play more becomes more and more natural, is this idea that a dice roll is usually some kind of failure. And so when you're rolling, the odds are quite low for success because, again, the idea is that there may have been other options available, or you may have been able to do something differently. And when you're rolling, it's this high stress moment. Your character's under a lot of stress, so they're not operating in this optimal fashion.
This is the section of the show that, honestly, I wish we could just spend 2 more hours talking about. What we have taken to calling Appendix N, the means, modes, and metaphors that influence the artists that make these works for us, and what they mean to them. You have presented some beautiful selections for us to check out. The first one is the very memorable scene from Nausicaa where the Tumican warships get attacked.
The barge detached! Tato, come on!
We're going down. We gotta get out of here. Princess!
Stop it! All this killing must stop!
One of the key inspirations for Cloud Empress, and a lot of my writing and creative work, is Hayao Miyazaki, watching these films quite young. One thing I've seen, and this isn't meant to be an outright dig or criticism, is that Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli have, in my eyes, often been a bit sanitized and commercialized in the marketplace. And when a project calls itself like Ghibli inspired or Miyazaki inspired, there's this cuteness to it. And I think that's appropriate in many cases and in many films. But even a film like My Neighbor Totoro has their mom in a hospital from a potentially incurable disease that we're not fully aware of, and the tragedy and the horror around that. My favorite works of Miyazaki's are Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind, both the film and the manga, and then Princess Mononoke, which had this deep impact on me as the first truly disturbing, haunting animated film that I had ever seen, really. The reason I selected this clip really was the justification for me putting the setting into the Mothership system. In Cloud Empress, you play as a person, and you are not necessarily a hero. And so the idea is that you may become a hero through luck, through maybe some skill, through happenstance. But what you see in the clip is that a lot of people die, and their deaths are treated with some consequence and attention. And it's not a victory celebration, even though they are an opposing and occupying force. The tragedy and the horror of it is still present. And also this feeling of helplessness. I think there's a unique story and a more realistic, haunting story that can be told when your ship might blow up and there's nothing you can do about it. And that may happen. I think what's so stunning about the scene is the powerlessness, even though we are with our heroine and she does eventually take some dramatic actions. It's luck and strange chance that she survives, and that the characters that survive do survive that scene, and not some, superhuman ability that these characters have, in my opinion, at least.
I think because we're on a YouTube format, I'm just going to show the Ursula Le Guin quote you provided now, and they can pause if they'd like to go back and take a look at that. One of the chief inspirations for Cloud Empress, you have said, is this album cover here from Andromeda by Wiseblood. Can you talk a little bit about why you chose to include that?
The Andromeda album was something I certainly pick things to listen to as I'm writing that have these subconscious effects on what I'm working on, but a lot's going to change, and the album cover itself very directly engage with climate change in a way that I think is very interesting. There's a sentimentality, there's a nostalgia, there's a personalization of these topics that I think is really artfully done, and I'm always interested in how my favorite artists are able to address current day political topics in a art form that doesn't totally bounce off of me or feel very stuck in an individual moment in time. And I think for me, what Andromeda does is create a mood and a theme that allows one to explore their own feelings of these issues, their own feelings of what it means that a lot's going to change. And there's also this haunting idea presented, I think, that I get stuck on sometimes, which is this idea that physically the world is constantly in the best place that it's probably ever going to be, at least for a long time, which is I think haunting. This idea that the planet is continually degrading due to mankind's interactions and efforts upon it. But I think the same thing could be said about our own human lives, right? We are the youngest we're ever going to be. And so this idea of how do we think about the passage of time is so important to the work, and polarization of those responses around like optimism and pessimism are very easy to go to, I think. This, oh my gosh, we've ruined the planet, this totally bleak vision of an apocalypse is really easy to go to as a first choice. And that's where I think that resilience and hope comes in, that I think, to connect back to Miyazaki's works, to me, always acknowledge the full spectrum of human emotion as well as human action and human experience. And I think that's the type of thing that I'm trying to explore in my work, is this brightness with the shadow, both things being present often very quickly next to one another, and how do we manage that on an individual level.
Watt, I have enjoyed our conversation on a level that would be inappropriate to disclose here in a public forum, but thank you so much for the time you've spent with us today. Lastly, you've got an exciting project up on BackerKit. Would you please tell us a little bit about that?
It is 2 new books that are expansions on the setting. One is called Land of the Living, the other is called Land of the Dead. Each contain 2 new biomes. In Land of the Living, we're exploring a world overgrown and out of control with mushrooms, fungi, and spores, but also people that live in harmony and community with those things. And then Land of the Dead is an exploration of the aftermath of a cloud city's fall from heights. So it impacts the earth like a meteor and creates miles upon miles of ashen wasteland, and the mystery of the city and the strange calls that are coming from it. I'm really excited too because I chose to work with an indigenous two-spirit local author, M. Matson, as part of working on Land of the Living, really diving into indigenous cultures of the future and really thinking about how indigenous life and indigenous resilience and native resilience exist within the world of Cloud Empress.
Thank you so much for publishing Cloud Empress and Hot Stuff on Shore Leave. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Let's pull up the HUD on our overview of Cloud Empress for Mothership from Worlds by Watt. Size. Cloud Empress has so much material available, it's more of a mindset than a single module. Spanning 2 manuals at 60-ish pages and 6 supplemental zines, as well as its own solo play pamphlet called Solo Protocol, Cloud Empress is a destination you and your crew could probably spend a year or more in, exploring the furthest reaches of the Hereafter. 5 out of 5 Cicadas. Artwork. So much love, consideration, and attention has been put into each page, every map, and each character portrait in Cloud Empress, down to the character sheets and supplemental materials. 5 out of 5 Cicadas. Flexibility. For its massive scope, Cloud Empress is shockingly easy to engage with your table immediately, whether that's importing your current Mothership crew or beginning a brand new adventure altogether. 5 out of 5 Cicadas. Spookiness. Now, here at the Panic Table, we recognize that spookiness is what you and your party make of it. At first blush, terrifying isn't the word that you would use to describe Cloud Empress. That was the case for me until I picked up Land of Cicadas. Monsters, morbid histories, near mythic nightmare scenarios, Cloud Empress has the potential to be terrifying on a number of fronts, interpersonally, on a survival standpoint, and heck, even ontologically. For that, 4 out of 5 cicadas. Total, 4.75 cicadas. Not bad. I know that I personally am going to be playing it this summer, and I am really looking forward to it. Thanks so much for joining us here at Mission Control. We've got more exciting publishers, artists, streamers, and schemers lined up, so stay tuned. Like, comment, subscribe, whatever. Until then, stay spooky. Cameron Danger Strip Matter, signing off.